Dalton Voss did not just kill her father, he made her scrub the blood off his boots and sleep under the table he ate at, and now, years later, as she burns with fever on another man's cot, his shadow rides back over the ridge with 3 crates of dynamite and her name on his tongue. When the next frontier yarn rolls out on Dusty Trail Stories, listen close, leave your mark in the comments, and swear yourself to that subscribe. The New Mexico sun hung heavy over Broken Mesa, turning the air thick and still. Dust coated everything, from the rough-hewn fence posts to the brim of a worn hat that had seen too many storms. The only sound for miles was the steady rhythm of a hammer striking cedar, each blow echoing across the empty land like a heartbeat that refused to die. Matthias Crowley worked alone, his shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows to let the dry heat lick at his skin. Sweat darkened the fabric across his broad shoulders as he drove another post deeper into the unforgiving earth. This land was his now, claimed through 5 years of solitude, 5 years of silence, and 5 years of trying to bury memories under wood and stone. He had been a scout once, a man who could read the land like a preacher reads scripture, but that life was ash now. He paused, wiping a forearm across his brow, and reached for his canteen. The water was warm, tasting of tin, but it cut the dust in his throat. As he lowered the vessel, his eyes scanned the horizon, a habit that never truly faded. A figure stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the afternoon sky. It was not moving, just watching. The hair on the back of his neck rose, old instincts stirring awake like a wolf sensing blood on the wind. He set down the canteen without making a sound, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. The figure began to descend, slow and unsteady, each step placed carefully as if the person might collapse at any moment. By the time the stranger reached the bottom of the slope, Matthias could see her clearly, and his chest tightened with a cold, familiar dread. It was a woman, young but with eyes that held a lifetime of sorrow. Her deerskin dress was torn, revealing bruises that mapped a story of violence across her ribs and shoulders. She stopped 8 feet from the fence, gripping the top rail to steady herself. Her breathing came fast, almost panicked, but her eyes never left his face. "Do you remember me, cowboy?" The question struck something deep inside him, pulling a memory from the darkness where he had tried to bury it, a child screaming beneath burning timber, tiny hands gripping his neck. It was Kimmy. The little girl he had pulled from the fire 5 years ago was now a woman, standing broken on his land. She opened her mouth to speak again, but her strength finally failed. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the dust, the sound of her body hitting the hard earth shattering the silence of the valley like a gunshot. Matthias moved before the dust had even settled around her boots, crossing the few yards of open ground with a speed that belied his years of stillness. He scooped her up in one fluid motion, his arms taking the weight of her as if she were made of nothing more than hollow bones and spirit. She was burning with fever, her skin radiating a dry, terrified heat that soaked instantly through his shirt. He carried her across the threshold of his cabin, kicking the door shut against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, plunging them into the cool, dim quiet of the room. The air smelled of sage, stale coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of the blood that stained her deerskin dress. He laid her carefully on his narrow cot, the wool blanket rough against her legs, and stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving not from exertion but from the sudden, violent intrusion of the past into his present. She was unconscious now, her breathing shallow and ragged, a sound that tore at the silence he had so carefully cultivated. Matthias turned to the iron stove, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin basin with hands that trembled ever so slightly. He had been a soldier, a scout, a man who had seen the insides of men spill out onto the desert floor, but seeing the bruises mapping the skin of the girl he had once saved unsettled him in a way gore never could. He soaked a rag and returned to her side, kneeling on the hard-packed dirt floor. As he wiped the grime and dried blood from her face, the reality of who she was, and who she was not, began to take hold. 5 years ago, she had been a child clinging to his neck in a burning canyon. Now, as he cleaned the raw rope burns on her wrists and the angry welt across her collarbone, he saw the curve of a woman's hip, the fullness of her lips, the strength inherent in her jawline. She shifted under his touch, a low moan escaping her throat, and her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy with pain. She did not pull away from his hand, instead, she leaned into the coolness of the wet cloth. The intimacy of the moment was thick in the room, heavier than the heat outside. When she spoke, her voice was a rasp of sandpaper on stone. "They sold me," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his with a desperate clarity. "To a man named Dalton Voss." The name hit Matthias like a physical blow, stopping his hand in mid-air. Dalton Voss. The man who had fed him the lies about Redcliffe Canyon. The architect of the massacre that had haunted Matthias's nightmares for 1,825 nights. A cold, hard knot of rage formed in his gut, tightening with every breath. She continued, her fingers reaching out to brush the white scar on his forearm, a ghost touching a ghost. "He hunts me, Matthias. He wants me back." The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was charged, dangerous, and electric. Matthias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a victim, but a woman who had walked through hell to find him. The distance between them, defined by years and blood and race, seemed to collapse in the dim light of the cabin. He was no longer just tending to a wounded stray, he was touching the only other soul on earth who carried the same scars he did, and in that shared pain, a new, terrifying heat began to rise, threatening to burn down the walls he had built around his heart. Night did not fall gently over the basin, it collapsed like a mine shaft giving way, sudden and suffocating, blotting out the harsh reality of the scrubland and replacing it with a darkness that felt alive. Inside the cabin, the air grew heavy and close, trapped between the rough-hewn logs and the barred door. Matthias had extinguished the main lantern, leaving only a single tallow candle sputtering on the table, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the fragility of their shelter. He sat on a crate by the window, the shutters cracked just enough to allow the barrel of his Winchester to peer out into the void. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the thorns of the mesquite and rattling the loose shingles of the roof, a sound that mimicked footsteps to an ear tuned for danger. But Matthias was not listening to the wind, he was listening to the woman breathing in the darkness behind him. Kimmy had risen from the cot, the fever having broken as quickly as the desert heat dissipated after sundown. She moved with a silent grace that unnerved him, her presence filling the small room until it felt as though there was no air left for him to breathe. She had found his spare shirt, a rough cotton thing that swallowed her small frame, and she sat now at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The silence between them was a physical weight, heavier than the timber beams above their heads. It was the silence of two people who knew that the dawn might bring death, and who were trying to navigate the treacherous territory of being alive in the meantime. Matthias kept his eyes on the ridge, scanning for the flicker of a match or the glint of starlight on steel, but his mind was entirely focused on the heat radiating from her across the room. She spoke then, her voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet. "Why does he want you dead, Matthias?" It was not a question of curiosity, but of strategy. She needed to know the shape of the trap they were in. Matthias lowered the rifle, resting the stock against his shoulder, and turned to look at her. The candle flame reflected in her dark eyes, two tiny points of fire that reminded him of the night Redcliffe Canyon burned. "It is not just hate," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It is greed. Voss did not just want to clear the land. He wanted what was under it. Gold. Veins of it running through the rock like marrow in a bone. I found the survey maps in his saddlebags the morning after the raid. That was why I led the soldiers there. He told me it was a war party. He told me you were preparing to raid the settlements. But he just wanted the tribe gone so he could blast the canyon apart without breaking the treaty." The confession hung in the air, ugly and naked. Matthias waited for her anger, for the accusation that he had been a fool, a pawn who had cost her everything. But it did not come. Instead, Kimmy stood up. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a harsh sound in the stillness. She walked toward him, not with the hesitation of a victim, but with the deliberate purpose of a hunter closing in. She stopped inches from him, close enough that he could smell the sage he had used to clean her wounds and the faint, underlying scent of her skin, musky and warm. "You carried the guilt for 5 years," she whispered, reaching out to touch the hand that held the rifle. "You built a prison out of this land and locked yourself inside it because you thought you deserved to suffer for his sins." Matthias looked down at her hand, her fingers dark against his pale, scarred knuckles. He wanted to pull away, to keep the wall up, but his body betrayed him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. "I am not a prisoner," he rasped, though he knew it was a lie. She stepped closer, her body brushing against his knees, forcing him to look up into her face. The bruises on her cheek were stark in the candlelight, but they did not diminish her, they only made her look like something forged in fire, unbreakable and fierce. "You are," she said. "But tonight, the door is open." The words were a challenge, a plea, and a command all at once. The tension that had been building since she collapsed at his fence line snapped. The threat of Dalton Voss, waiting out there in the dark with his dynamite and his hatred, faded into the background, eclipsed by the immediate, overwhelming reality of the woman standing before him. Matthias set the rifle down against the wall, his movements slow and deliberate, surrendering his weapon for the first time in 5 years. He reached out, his hands trembling as they found her waist, pulling her toward him. She did not resist, she melted into him, a soft exhale of breath against his neck that sent a shiver racing down his spine. This was not gentle. There was no room for gentleness in a world that wanted them dead. It was desperate, a collision of two broken things trying to make something whole before the end. Her mouth found his, tasting of coffee and salt, and the kiss was a searing brand, burning away the years of solitude. Matthias buried his hands in her hair, the feathers woven there brushing against his wrists, and pulled her closer, until there was no space left between them, until the heat of her body seeped into his own, driving out the cold that had lived in his marrow since the war. They moved together in the flickering shadows, a tangle of limbs and scarred skin, seeking oblivion in the friction. It was a reclaiming. Every touch was a defiance of death, every gasp a testament that they were still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than regret. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, became a sanctuary of sound, the rustle of fabric, the catch of breath, the low, guttural sounds of need. Matthias lifted her onto the table, sweeping the tin cup and the maps to the floor with a crash that neither of them heeded. He needed to feel her, to anchor himself to the earth through her, to prove to the ghosts watching from the corners that life, stubborn and violent, still burned in this valley. For an hour, or perhaps a lifetime, the war outside ceased to exist. There was only the sweat on her skin, the arch of her back, the way her nails dug into his shoulders as if she were trying to tether him to the world. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together on the narrow cot, the candle having burned down to a pool of wax, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of solitude. It was the quiet of a storm that has passed, leaving the air charged and clean. Matthias held her against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of her heart, and knew with a terrifying certainty that the stakes had changed. Yesterday, he had been fighting for survival. Tomorrow, he would be fighting for her. He looked toward the window, where the first gray hint of false dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, and felt the old, cold resolve of the scout settle over him. Voss was coming. Let him come. Matthias Crowley had something to lose now, and God help the man who tried to take it. The hour before dawn was the coldest, a time when the desert shed the memory of the sun and lay naked under a sky that had turned the color of bruised iron. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with the musk of their bodies and the lingering scent of burned tallow, but the heat of the night had evaporated, leaving behind a chill that settled deep in the marrow. Matthias Crowley sat against the rough-hewn logs of the wall, his spine stiff, the Winchester resting across his knees like an extension of his own limbs. He had not slept. Sleep was a luxury for men who did not have wolves circling their door, and Matthias knew with a grim certainty that the wolves were not just circling, they were preparing to breach. He watched Kimmy sleeping on the narrow cot, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too fragile for the world they occupied. In the gray, flat light of the false dawn, her face was softened, the fierce lines of survival smoothed away to reveal the young woman beneath, and looking at her caused a dull ache in his chest that terrified him more than the men waiting in the dark. He had spent 5 years hollowing himself out, turning his heart into a stone that could not break, and in one night, she had cracked it open. Now, he had something to lose again. The sound came from the north side of the cabin, low and rhythmic, distinct from the wind rattling the dry sagebrush. It was not the heavy thud of a boot, nor the scratch of an animal, it was a tapping, frantic and irregular, against the wood of the doorframe. Matthias was on his feet before the second tap sounded, moving with the silent, fluid grace of a man who had spent half his life hunting things that could hunt him back. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor, and pressed his back against the wall beside the door. He signaled to Kimmy, who had bolted upright at his movement, her hand already gripping the heavy Colt revolver he had given her. Her eyes were wide, the sleep vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, predatory alertness. Matthias listened, his ear pressed to the wood. The tapping came again, accompanied by a voice, hoarse and desperate, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Open the door. Please. He plans to burn it." Matthias did not unbar the door. Instead, he slid the viewing slat open an inch, the barrel of his rifle leveled at the gap. Through the sliver of space, he saw a face distorted by pain and shadow. It was an Apache man, young, sweat streaking through the dust on his skin, his eyes darting frantically toward the ridge. He was clutching his left shoulder, where dark blood seeped between his fingers, slick and black in the low light. Matthias recognized the type of wound, it was messy, a grazing shot or a ricochet, the kind that burned like a brand. "Let me in," the man gasped, seeing the glint of the rifle barrel. "I am alone. I am not with them anymore." Matthias weighed the risk in a heartbeat. It could be a trick, a way to get the door open for a rush, but the terror in the man's eyes looked raw and real. He glanced back at Kimmy, who had moved silently to the center of the room, the revolver held steady in both hands. She nodded, once, a sharp dip of her chin. Matthias slid the heavy oak bar back and jerked the door open, grabbing the man by his good arm and hauling him inside before slamming the wood shut and throwing the bolt home. The stranger collapsed against the table, sliding down to the floor as his legs gave out. He was breathing in ragged, wet gasps, his chest heaving. Matthias stood over him, the rifle trained on his chest, while Kimmy moved forward with a canteen. She knelt beside him, lifting his head to let him drink, her movements efficient but wary. As the water washed the grime from his face, her expression shifted from caution to shock. "Takakota." She breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer or a curse. The man looked up, water dripping from his chin, and tried to smile, though it looked more like a grimace of pain. "Kimmy," he rasped. "I thought you were dead in the canyon. I thought we were all dead." Kimmy looked up at Matthias, her eyes shining with sudden, unshed tears. "He was my brother's friend," she said, her voice trembling. "He stood with us when the soldiers came. He is not one of them." Matthias lowered the rifle but did not safe it. "If he is your friend, why is he running with the man who killed your father?" he asked, his voice hard. Takakota flinched, shame flushing his dark skin. He pulled himself up to a sitting position, wincing as his shoulder shifted. "Dalton Voss took me 6 weeks ago," he said, his voice bitter. "He caught me tracking near the salt flats. He told me if I did not track for him, he would find my sister. He knows where the remnants of the tribe are hiding. He said he would sell her to the miners in the north. I had no choice." He looked down at his hands, calloused and shaking. "I have been leading him in circles for 3 days, trying to give you time, trying to find a way to get away. But yesterday, he realized. He shot me. He left me for the coyotes, but I crawled out of the wash. I had to warn you. What is the plan? Matthias asked, crouching down so he was eye level with the wounded man. The time for judgment was later, right now, he needed intelligence. Takakota took a deep breath, steadying himself. He has 4 men, plus himself. They are not coming to fight. They are coming to erase you. He has dynamite, 3 crates of it stolen from the mining company. He does not want a shootout, he wants to blow the cabin apart while you are sleeping inside. He plans to surround the perimeter just before sunrise, light the fuses, and level everything. He wants no survivors, no witnesses. Just the rubble and the gold he thinks is buried under your floorboards. The room went silent, the gravity of the news settling over them like a shroud. Dynamite. It changed everything. A siege they could fight, they had ammunition, cover, and water. But against explosives, the cabin was not a fortress, it was a coffin. The thick logs Matthias had cut and stacked with his own hands would become shrapnel. Staying inside meant death. Running meant being cut down in the open. They were trapped in a box, and the lid was being nailed shut. Kimmy looked at the walls, her eyes wide, realizing the sanctuary they had found comfort in only hours ago was now a death trap. We have to leave, she whispered. We have to run. No, Matthias said, the word flat and final. We cannot outrun horses on foot, not in this terrain. And if we run, he will hunt us down one by one. Men like Voss do not stop until the loose ends are tied or they are dead. He stood up, pacing the small length of the room, his mind working through the geometry of the land outside. The ridge to the east, the dry creek bed to the south, the cluster of boulders to the west. Voss was expecting rats in a trap. He was expecting them to be asleep, or cowering in the dark. He was arrogant, blinded by his own power and the belief that he held all the cards. That was his weakness. We do not run, Matthias said, turning back to them. We attack. We hit them before they are ready. We turn the hunter into the prey. Takakota looked at him, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. There are 5 of them. Heavily armed. You are 1 man and a woman. And I am useless with this arm. Matthias shook his head. You are not useless. You are the bait. He outlined the plan quickly, his voice low and urgent. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice that relied entirely on timing and the greed of a man Matthias hated more than the devil himself. They would leave the cabin now, under the cover of the last darkness. They would position themselves in the terrain surrounding the approach, the ravine that cut through the property like a scar. Takakota would go back. He would present himself to Voss, claim he had dragged himself back to prove his loyalty, claim he had scouted the cabin and found the door unbarred, the occupants asleep. He would lure them in, draw them into the crossfire, away from the dynamite, away from the cabin. It will get you killed, Kimmy said, her hand gripping Takakota's good arm. If he suspects you are lying. Takakota placed his hand over hers. If I do not do this, we all die. And my sister, if Voss lives, she is doomed anyway. This is the only way to redeem what I have done. His eyes met Matthias's, and in that look, the 2 men reached an understanding that transcended words. It was the understanding of soldiers who knew the price of a mission. You have to make it convincing, Matthias said. You have to make him believe he has already won. Takakota nodded slowly. He is a vain man. He believes what he wants to believe. He will believe I am too broken to lie. They moved quickly then, gathering only what was essential. Matthias loaded his pockets with cartridges for the Winchester and the revolver. He handed Kimmy a belt of ammunition for the Colt, his hands lingering on hers for a second. Stay low, he told her. Do not fire until I fire. You watch the south ridge. If anyone tries to flank us, you drop them. Do not hesitate. Kimmy nodded, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She was no longer the trembling girl at the fence, she was a warrior preparing for battle. Matthias felt a surge of pride, fierce and hot, mixed with the terrified realization that he was sending the woman he loved into the line of fire. But there was no other choice. They slipped out the back of the cabin, moving like ghosts into the pre-dawn chill. The air was crisp, biting at their skin. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten, a faint bruise of purple against the black, signaling that time was running out. They split up at the edge of the clearing. Takakota limped away toward the north, toward where Voss's camp smoke had been spotted, his silhouette disappearing into the brush. Matthias watched him go, a silent prayer on his lips that the boy had enough strength left to play his part. Then he turned to Kimmy. She was looking at him, her eyes dark pools in the shadows. "Come back to me," she whispered, the words fierce and commanding. Matthias reached out, cupping her cheek with his rough hand, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I am not going anywhere," he promised. "We survive this. We rebuild." He watched her move into position among the scrub oak of the South Ravine, her body blending perfectly with the land, before he turned and made his way to the rocky outcrop overlooking the approach. He settled his body into the dust, the cold seeping into his belly, and rested the barrel of the rifle on a flat stone. He checked the action, the metallic click soundless in the vast silence of the desert. Below him, the cabin stood dark and silent, a wooden box waiting to be shattered. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the sun. Wait for the enemy. Wait to see if the gamble would pay off in blood or freedom. Matthias slowed his breathing, his heart rate dropping to the steady, rhythmic thump of a predator in waiting. He thought of the way Kimmy had felt in his arms only hours ago, the heat of her skin, the taste of her mouth, and he used that memory to sharpen his focus, to hone his anger into a weapon as deadly as the rifle in his hands. Dalton Voss was coming to destroy a home. He was about to find out that he had walked into a slaughterhouse. The first rim of the sun crested the distant mountains, painting the desert floor in streaks of blood red, and in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats began to drum against the earth. The sun crested the eastern ridge like a bloody eye opening on the world, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the basin floor. Matthias Crowley lay motionless behind the granite outcrop, his body pressed so firmly into the earth that the sharp grit of the sandstone bit into his skin through his shirt. He did not feel it. He felt only the cold, heavy weight of the Winchester rifle in his hands and the slow, rhythmic thud of his own heart, beating a war drum against his ribs. The waiting was always the hardest part. It was the time when a man's mind turned against him, when the ghosts of past failures rose up from the dust to whisper that he was not fast enough, not strong enough, not ruthless enough to survive what was coming. Matthias pushed the thoughts away, forcing his breath to slow, forcing his eyes to scan the scrubland with the detached precision of a hawk. Below him, the cabin sat silent and still, a wooden monument to the life he had tried to build, now nothing more than bait in a trap designed to catch a monster. He looked toward the South Ravine, where the shadows were deepest, searching for the glint of Kimmy's rifle or the shift of fabric, but he saw nothing. She had learned well. The thought brought a fierce, painful swell of pride to his chest, quickly followed by a crushing wave of fear. She was out there alone, armed with a weapon she had only learned to fire yesterday, waiting to kill men who had made murder a trade. If he failed today, if his aim was true but his luck was sour, she would be left to their mercy, and that thought hardened his resolve like tempered steel. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a dull thunder rolling over the hard-packed earth. They were coming. Matthias shifted the rifle stock against his shoulder, his cheek welding to the wood, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. He watched the northern trail, where the sagebrush gave way to the open clearing. First came the dust, a low cloud kicked up by the horses, hanging in the still air. Then the riders emerged, 5 of them, moving in a loose formation that spoke of arrogance rather than caution. At the lead rode a man on a black gelding, sitting tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed, almost regal. Even at this distance, Matthias recognized the cut of the coat, the tilt of the hat, the way the man seemed to own the very air he rode through. Dalton Voss. Seeing him in the flesh after 5 years sent a shock of pure, unadulterated hatred through Matthias's veins, hot and bitter as bile. Voss looked exactly as Matthias remembered him, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, his face clean-shaven, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, scanning the land not for danger, but for profit. Flanking him were 3 hired guns, men with the hard, worn look of saddle tramps who would shoot their own mothers for $1. And riding slightly ahead, slumped in the saddle as if broken, was Takakota. The young Apache played his part with a terrifying realism. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, blood dark on his shirt, and his head lolled with the motion of the horse. He pointed toward the cabin with his good hand, saying something Matthias could not hear, but the gesture was clear. There they are. Sleeping. Unaware. Voss pulled his horse up, raising a hand to halt the column. He sat there for a long moment, studying the cabin, the silence of the morning, the lack of smoke from the chimney. Matthias held his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. If Voss sensed the trap now, if he turned and rode out, they would lose their chance. Or worse, if he ordered his men to light the dynamite from here and throw it, the plan would dissolve into chaos. But greed was a powerful blinder. Voss laughed, a sound that carried across the distance, sharp and cutting. He signaled to his men, and they dismounted, tying their horses to the mesquite bushes at the edge of the clearing. They pulled heavy wooden crates from their saddlebags, dynamite. Matthias watched through the sights of his rifle as they began to move toward the cabin on foot, spread out in a skirmish line, confident in their surprise. Takakota remained on his horse for a moment, then slid down awkwardly, stumbling as his feet hit the ground. He limped toward Voss, speaking rapidly, gesturing to the ravine, to the ridge, trying to draw them further into the kill zone. Voss stopped. He turned to look at Takakota, and even from 200 yards away, Matthias saw the shift in the man's body language. The arrogance vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a viper. Voss looked at the cabin, then back at the Apache. He looked at the ground, at the lack of fresh tracks leading to the door. He knew. The realization hit Matthias in the same second it hit Voss. The trap was sprung too early. Voss drew his pistol with a speed that blurred the eye, leveling it not at the cabin, but at Takakota's chest. The shout echoed across the valley. Liar! The gunshot was the crack of doom. Takakota jerked backward as if kicked by a mule, falling into the dust. He did not scream, he just crumpled. Matthias did not think. He did not hesitate. The world narrowed down to the front sight of his Winchester and the center of Dalton Voss's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the boom shattering the morning silence. But Voss was fast, unnaturally fast. In the fraction of a second between the trigger pull and the bullet's arrival, he had thrown himself sideways behind a boulder. Matthias's shot struck the rock, sending a spray of stone chips into the air where Voss's head had been a moment before. Fire! Voss screamed from cover. It's an ambush. Kill them all. The valley erupted. The 3 hired men scattered like quail, diving for cover behind the water trough, the woodpile, and the corner of the corral. They opened fire blindly at the ridge, their bullets chipping away at the granite inches from Matthias's face. He ducked, working the lever of his rifle, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a fresh round with a metallic clack-clack that he felt in his bones. He popped up, fired a snap shot at a man trying to flank around the corral, and saw the man spin and go down, clutching his thigh. 1 down. 3 to go. From the south ravine, the heavy boom of the Colt revolver joined the chorus. Kimmy was firing. Matthias risked a glance and saw a puff of smoke rising from the scrub oak. She had pinned down the man behind the water trough, her shots chipping the wood, forcing him to keep his head down. She was holding her ground. But the third man, a bearded giant with a shotgun, had pinpointed her position. He broke cover, running in a crouch toward the ravine, the twin barrels of his weapon looking like black eyes of death. "No!" Matthias roared. He swung his rifle, tracking the runner. The man was moving fast, weaving through the brush. Matthias led him, breathing out, and squeezed. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he did not fall. He stumbled, dropped to one knee, and raised the shotgun toward Kimmy's position. Matthias worked the lever again, clack clack, but before he could fire, a second shot rang out from the ravine. The man's head snapped back, and he collapsed into the dirt, still. Kimmy had dropped him. 2 down. But Voss was still there. And the third man, the one Matthias had hit in the leg, was crawling toward the horses, toward the dynamite. If he reached those crates, if he managed to light a fuse and throw a stick, the game changed. Matthias scrambled down from the ridge, abandoning his high ground. He needed to close the distance. He slid down the shale slope, rocks clattering around him, moving with a reckless speed that bordered on madness. Bullets whined past him like angry hornets, kicking up spurts of dust at his feet. He hit the flat ground and rolled, coming up behind the cover of the heavy fence post he had driven into the earth only yesterday. He was 50 yards from the cabin now. The man with the wounded leg had reached the saddlebags. He was fumbling with something, a match. Matthias raised the rifle, aiming not at the man, but at the ground in front of him. He fired, the bullet kicking dirt into the man's face. The man flinched, dropping the match. He reached for his pistol, but Matthias was already moving, sprinting across the open ground, firing from the hip to keep the man's head down. He reached the water trough and vaulted over it, landing in the mud. Where was Voss? The silence from the boulder where the leader had taken cover was unnerving. Matthias pressed his back against the wet wood of the trough, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. He listened. He heard the groans of the man with the leg wound. He heard the wind. He heard the terrified whinny of the horses. But he did not hear Voss. Matthias. Kimmy's scream tore through the air. He spun around. Voss had not stayed behind the boulder. He had used the chaos to circle back, moving through the dry creek bed like a snake. He was now behind Matthias, standing near the corner of the cabin, his pistol leveled at Matthias's back. But he was not looking at Matthias. He was looking at the ravine, where Kimmy had broken cover to run toward the cabin. He had the drop on her. "Drop the rifle, Crowley," Voss yelled, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady amidst the carnage. "Drop it, or the girl dies. I'll put a bullet through her heart before you can blink." Matthias froze. The distance was too great. Even if he spun and fired, Voss already had his aim. He saw Kimmy stop in the open, her chest heaving, the revolver hanging heavy in her hand. She looked at Matthias, her eyes wide with fear, but she did not beg. She stood tall. "Do it," Voss commanded. "Drop it." Matthias slowly lowered the Winchester to the dirt. He raised his hands, palms open. "Let her go, Dalton," he said, his voice low. "This is between you and me. It always has been." Voss laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "Between us? You were a tool, Crowley. A useful idiot. You think I care about you? I care about the gold under this dirt. I care about the loose ends you represent. But I admit, watching you squirm is a pleasant bonus." He shifted his aim slightly, back toward Matthias, but kept his eyes on Kimmy. "Walk toward me, girl. Slowly. Keep that gun pointed at the ground." Kimmy hesitated, then took a step forward. Her eyes were locked on Voss, burning with a hatred that could scorch the earth. "That's it," Voss sneered. "Come closer. Let's see the prize I lost." Matthias's mind raced. He was 20 feet from Voss. He had a knife in his boot, but he would never reach it in time. He needed a distraction. He needed a miracle. His eyes darted to the side, to where Takakota lay in the dust. The boy had not moved since the first shot. He looked dead. But as Matthias watched, he saw the fingers of Takakota's good hand twitch. They were inches from a discarded revolver, dropped by one of the hired guns. "You destroyed everything," Matthias said, speaking loudly, trying to keep Voss's attention focused on him. "You killed women and children for rock. Does that sit heavy on your soul, Dalton? Or do you even have one?" Voss smirked, stepping away from the cabin wall, his confidence absolute. "Soul. That's a fairy tale for poor men, Crowley. Power is the only reality. And I have the power. I have the law in my pocket, the gold in the ground, and your lives in my hand." "Not all of them," a weak voice rasped. Voss frowned, his eyes flickering for a fraction of a second toward the ground where Takakota lay. In that instant, the young Apache rolled onto his side, lifting the heavy pistol with a groan of agony. He fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust at Voss's feet, but it was enough. Voss flinched, turning his gun toward the boy to finish him. "Now!" Matthias roared. He lunged. He did not go for a weapon, he went for the man. He covered the distance in 2 strides, colliding with Voss like a freight train. The impact drove the air from both their lungs. Voss's pistol went off, the bullet tearing through the sleeve of Matthias's shirt, searing the skin but missing the bone. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust, a tangle of limbs and fury. Voss was strong, stronger than he looked, and he fought with the vicious desperation of a man used to winning. He drove a knee into Matthias's stomach, doubling him over, and brought the barrel of the pistol down toward Matthias's skull. Matthias caught his wrist. He gripped it with both hands, straining against the leverage, his teeth gritted so hard he thought they might shatter. The gun hovered inches from his face, the black eye of the muzzle staring him down. Dust filled his nose and mouth. He could smell Voss, expensive cologne, sweat, and gunpowder. "You should have died in the canyon." Voss snarled, spit flying onto Matthias's face. He pressed down, his weight bearing down on Matthias's chest. "You should have burned with the rest of them." Matthias roared, a primal sound that came from the bottom of his soul, and twisted. He did not try to push the gun away, he twisted Voss's wrist inward, against the joint. There was a sickening pop, and Voss screamed, dropping the gun. Matthias scrambled up, straddling Voss's chest, and drove his fist into the man's face. Once. Twice. The blows were heavy, meat striking bone, fueled by 5 years of nightmares. Voss's nose shattered. Blood sprayed across the dust. But Voss was not done. He bucked his hips, throwing Matthias off balance, and scrambled backward, reaching into his boot. A knife flashed in the sun, a long, wicked Bowie blade. He lunged at Matthias, slashing the air. Matthias stumbled back, his foot catching on a rock, and he fell hard on his back. Voss was on him in a second, the knife raised for the killing stroke. His face was a mask of blood and madness. "Die!" Voss shrieked. The blade came down. Matthias threw his arm up to block it, bracing for the steel to bite into his flesh. The shot was deafeningly loud at close range. Voss jerked. The knife stopped inches from Matthias's face. A look of profound confusion washed over Voss's bloody features. He looked down at his chest, where a small red hole had appeared in his fine linen shirt. He looked up, his eyes unfocused, searching past Matthias. Matthias turned his head. Kimmy stood 10 feet away, the Colt revolver held in both hands, smoke drifting lazily from the barrel. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, but her hands were steady as stone. She cocked the hammer back again, the mechanical click loud in the sudden silence. Voss made a gurgling sound. The knife slipped from his fingers, landing harmlessly in the dirt. He swayed, then toppled sideways like a felled tree, staring up at the empty blue sky with eyes that saw nothing. Matthias lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, staring at the dead man. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had stopped. The horses had stopped screaming. Even the dust seemed to hang suspended in the air. He pushed himself up slowly, his body aching in 100 places, and looked at Kimmy. She lowered the gun, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline left her. She looked at the body of Voss, then at Matthias, and then her gaze drifted to the spot where Takakota lay. She dropped the gun and ran. Matthias scrambled to his feet and followed her. They reached Takakota at the same time. The boy was lying on his back, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. His chest was a mess of blood where Voss's first bullet had taken him. He looked up at them, his eyes bright with fever and fading life. Did we win? He whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. Kimmy fell to her knees beside him, taking his hand in hers. She was weeping now, open, heart-wrenching sobs. Yes, she choked out. Yes, Takakota. We won. He is dead. They are all dead. Takakota smiled, a faint ghost of a thing. He squeezed her hand weakly. Good, he breathed. Tell my sister, tell her I did not die a slave. Tell her I died, a warrior. You are a warrior, Matthias said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt beside the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. The bravest I have ever known. Takakota's gaze shifted to the sky. The ancestors, he whispered. They are, waiting. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and then he was still. The light faded from his eyes, leaving them fixed on a horizon that only he could see. Kimmy bowed her head over his chest, her cries echoing off the canyon walls, a keen of mourning that cut through Matthias's heart. He sat back on his heels, the dust settling around them, the sun beating down on the dead and the living alike. They had won. The enemy was destroyed. But as he looked at the boy who had given everything for a freedom he would never taste, Matthias knew that the victory was painted in the color of blood, and the cost was higher than any gold that lay beneath the earth. He reached out and gently closed Takakota's eyes, while the desert watched in indifferent silence. They buried Takakota on the ridge facing the rising sun, in ground so hard it seemed to resent the intrusion of the spade. It took Matthias the better part of 2 hours to dig the grave, his muscles screaming in protest, the sweat running in rivets down his dust-caked back. Kimmy worked beside him, clearing away the stones with her bare hands, her face set in a mask of grief that was as ancient and enduring as the landscape itself. They did not speak, there were no words left that could carry the weight of the morning. When the earth was finally piled back over the boy who had died a warrior, they stood in silence, the wind tugging at their clothes, the only eulogy the dry rustle of the sagebrush and the distant call of a hawk circling a thermal. Matthias looked at the fresh mound of dirt, then at the bodies of Dalton Voss and his hired men, which they had dragged into a shallow ravine to be dealt with later. The violence of the dawn felt like a fever dream now, fading under the harsh, bleaching light of noon. He turned to Kimmy, reaching out to take her hand. Her palm was rough, calloused, and warm. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she had stumbled onto his land, the fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary, fragile hope. We are free, she whispered, testing the words as if she expected them to break. He is gone. Matthias nodded, squeezing her hand. He is gone. We can start over. We can build something here that he can never touch. He led her back to the cabin, where the bullet holes in the walls let in shafts of bright, dusty light. They sat on the floor, drinking tepid water from the canteen, sharing a strip of dried meat. The simple act of eating, of swallowing, felt like a victory. Matthias allowed himself to think of the future, of repairing the roof, of planting corn in the spring near the creek bed, of waking up next to her without the revolver under his pillow. It was a seductive dream, one he had denied himself for 5 long years. But the desert was a jealous mistress, and she rarely gave up her dead without a price. The sound began as a vibration in the floorboards, a low rumble that Matthias felt in his teeth before he heard it with his ears. He froze, the strip of meat halfway to his mouth. Kimmy went rigid, her eyes darting to the open door. Horses. Many of them. Shod hooves striking stone. It was not the erratic gallop of raiders, but the disciplined, thunderous cadence of a column. Matthias grabbed the Winchester and moved to the door, squinting into the glare. A cloud of dust, thick and yellow, was rolling toward them from the east, churning up the valley floor. Through the haze, he saw the flash of brass buttons and the dark blue of wool uniforms. The cavalry. Relief, sharp and sudden, washed over him, nearly buckling his knees. It was the army. They had likely heard the dynamite that had not gone off, or perhaps they were on a patrol and had seen the smoke. They represented law, order, the end of the chaos. Voss was a criminal, a slaver, a murderer, and now there were witnesses to prove it. "Stay here," he told Kimmy, resting the rifle against the doorframe as a sign of peace. "It is the patrol. It is over. We are safe." He walked out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers, and watched as the column of 20 riders slowed and fanned out in front of the cabin. The leader was a lieutenant, a man with a face like a hatchet, sharp and humorless, his mustache waxed to needle points. He sat on a bay gelding that looked too fine for this rough country, his uniform immaculate despite the dust. He looked down at Matthias with eyes the color of slate, cold and unreadable. Behind him, the troopers sat with their carbines resting on their thighs, their expressions bored and dangerous. Matthias stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice raspy. "I am grateful for your arrival. We have had trouble here." "A man named Dalton Voss," the lieutenant raised a gloved hand, cutting him off. "Silence," he commanded, his voice distinct and clipped, carrying the flat vowels of the East. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the dirt, and walked past Matthias without a glance. He moved toward the ravine, where the bodies lay. 2 sergeants followed him. Matthias stood on the porch, a sudden, cold unease pricking at the back of his neck. He watched as the lieutenant stopped over the body of Dalton Voss. The officer nudged the corpse with the toe of his boot, then knelt, brushing the dust from Voss's face. He stayed there for a long moment, speaking in low tones to his sergeants, before standing up and brushing his gloves together. He turned back to the cabin, his face hard. "Sergeant, arrest that man," the lieutenant said, pointing a gloved finger at Matthias. 2 soldiers dismounted instantly, rushing forward with iron shackles. Matthias stepped back, shock freezing his blood. "Arrest? For what?" "That man is Dalton Voss. He is a slaver. He attacked my home. He killed an Apache boy not 3 hours ago. I acted in self-defense." The soldiers grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back with practiced brutality. The cold bite of the iron cuffs snapped around his wrists. Kimmy screamed, running from the doorway, the Colt revolver in her hand but pointing at the ground. "No. He saved me. He is a good man. Drop the weapon." The lieutenant roared, drawing his saber. 3 carbines leveled at her chest. Matthias lunged against the soldiers holding him. "Do not shoot." "Kimmy, put it down. Put it down." She froze, looking from the leveled rifles to Matthias's desperate face, and slowly let the revolver fall to the dirt. A soldier kicked it away and grabbed her by the hair, dragging her backward. She cried out, a sound of pure terror that tore through Matthias's heart. "Lieutenant, listen to me." Matthias shouted, struggling against the men holding him. Voss was kidnapping people. He was selling them to the mines. Look in his saddlebags. Look at the maps. He orchestrated the Red Cliff massacre to get at the gold. The lieutenant walked up to Matthias, stopping inches from his face. He smelled of bay rum and horse sweat. Mr. Voss, the officer said quietly, almost conversationally, was a respected government contractor. He was a personal friend of the territorial governor. He was out here on authorized business, reclaiming property and surveying land for the betterment of this territory. And I find him dead, shot in the back by a squatter and a savage. He shot first. Matthias yelled, spit flying. He killed the boy. The lieutenant slapped him. It was a sharp, stinging blow that snapped Matthias' head to the side. There is no boy, the officer said. I see a dead citizen and his employees. And I see a known deserter. Yes, I know who you are, Crowley, consorting with a hostile. He looked over at Kimmy, his lip curling in disgust. A hostile who, by the looks of it, is escaped property of the reservation system. This is murder. Matthias roared. This is not the law. I am the law out here, Crowley, the lieutenant said, turning his back. And the law says you do not kill white men of standing to protect a savage. He gestured to the soldiers holding Kimmy. Restrain the female. She goes back to the reservation at San Carlos. If she survives the trek. No. Matthias surged forward, fueled by a rage so white-hot it blinded him. He threw one soldier off, slamming his shoulder into the other, driving him into the dirt. He ran toward Kimmy, his shackled hands raised as a weapon. He made it 3 steps before the butt of a carbine slammed into the back of his skull. The world exploded into white light, then faded to gray. Matthias fell to his knees, the taste of copper filling his mouth. He looked up, his vision swimming, to see Kimmy fighting like a wildcat. She bit the hand of the man holding her, scratched at his eyes, screaming Matthias' name. But there were too many of them. They threw her to the ground, binding her wrists and ankles with rawhide, tossing her over the back of a pack horse like a sack of grain. Burn it, the lieutenant ordered, gesturing to the cabin. No, Matthias groaned, blood dripping from his nose into the dust. Please. The soldiers kicked open the door, smashing the oil lamps, tossing lit torches onto the bedding. The dry timber, seasoned by 5 years of desert sun, caught instantly. Flames licked up the walls, devouring the table where they had eaten, the cot where they had loved, the roof that had sheltered them. The black smoke rose in a column, joining the dust of the arrival, a funeral pyre for a life that had ended before it truly began. The lieutenant mounted his horse, looking down at Matthias, who was being hauled to his feet by the sergeants. You will be taken to Fort Stanton, the officer said. You will be tried for the murder of Dalton Voss. And you will hang, Crowley. Make no mistake. Matthias did not look at him. He looked at the pack horse where Kimmy was tied. She had stopped fighting. She was looking at him, her face bloody and swollen, her eyes wide and empty. She did not scream anymore. She just watched him, a silent witness to the end of their world. The soldiers tied Matthias' shackles to a saddle horn, forcing him to walk behind the horse. The column began to move. Matthias stumbled, the rope growing taut, dragging him forward. He looked back one last time. The cabin was fully engulfed now, the flames roaring, the heat blistering his skin even from this distance. The ridge where Takakota lay was silent. The land was silent. The only sound was the jingle of the cavalry bits and the crackle of the fire destroying everything he had built. He locked eyes with Kimmy one last time as the horses turned, separating them in the formation. She mouthed a word he could not hear over the roar of the fire, but he knew what it was. It was the same word she had asked him at the fence line. Remember. Matthias Crowley bowed his head, the dust of the trail filling his lungs, and walked into the long, dark shadow of the law, leaving his heart burning in the ashes behind him. The sun beat down, indifferent and cruel, on a land where justice was just another story men told themselves to sleep at night. It was 1885, and the West was won, not by heroes, but by the men who wrote the history in blood and ink, burying the truth deep beneath the hard, unforgiving earth.